Anthony Albanese is talking about his wedding plans, and Peter Dutton has confessed he met his wife after drinking 20 vodka Red Bulls.
20? How's he alive? Holy smokes, that's a lot.
These confessions can mean only one thing. There is an election brewing. We don't have a date yet, but as Jacqueline Maley wrote in the Herald and Age newspapers over the weekend, there is no surer sign of a looming poll than the rash of personal soft touch interviews. So a soft touch interview basically refers to the kind of interview that involves a politician's partner, often their children, and the conventional wisdom is that these figures being around the politician help to soften his image, and yes, it is normally a him. Maley wrote that she found this fact depressing, this idea that men still need women to humanize them as politicians. And she also argues that these interviews are a bit of a distraction. And Albanese did come into some criticism from his own party for this Women's Weekly interview he gave with his fiancée, Jodie Hayden. One Labor backbencher told the Financial Review that the timing of the interview, just as the Reserve Bank announced it was dropping interest rates, was really bad, and it made the Prime Minister look out of touch. But here I am with a hot take for you, which is that I happen to disagree with these criticisms. I love hearing about politicians' partners.
Same.
And the reason is that I think it's a valid way of assessing them and of figuring out how they make decisions, because who someone is married to or who someone spends their time with, it shows us a lot about what they value and what they think is important and what they care about in others. So I will always defend my interest in politicians' partners. But what do you think, Jessie?
Don't you think that might be the case if it wasn't entirely manufactured? Like, do you reckon that we're really getting an insight into their relationship?
20 Red Bull vodkas? I don't think people would make that up.
But that's a selective detail. And I totally agreed with the criticism about Anthony Albanese and the interest rate cuts, because that came out, cost of living crisis, that for the Labor election campaign, that's going to be a really important point. That just seemed like such a missed opportunity. If you have one message, that needed to be the message that day. And I actually don't think it was totally Albanese's fault, because he did that interview before.
Yeah, and it was actually for International Women's Day, by the way.
Yes, and then it came out at the same time, and I think that there was a headline that was telling me what role Toto the dog would be playing in the wedding. And I thought, yeah, that's not really, what does that actually tell me as a voter? Isn't it a distraction? And then when I was looking at the Women's Weekly feature, you know, you're looking at the photo shoot and they've sat down and done this interview, and there's the cynical side of me that goes, what a waste of time. Like, how about policy and tell us what we're voting for, and the performing of personality.
What's she talking about?
The performing of personality takes a lot of work.
Jessie, what role is Toto the dog playing in Albo and Jodie's wedding?
Yeah, can you tell us?
He's buried the lead.
Ring bearer?
I didn't click. I didn't read, guys.
I think it's like, I genuinely think that that's true, Jessie, that we need to know about policy and stuff. But you know what? We will, because they're going to be doing a lot of that. What Amelia said is true. Whether it's right or wrong, we do consider people's personal lives to tell us something about them. We do it all the time. I just did it with poor old Timothy Chalamet. We often do it with people who we might work with or whatever.
Doesn't it betray our own biases and 100% stigma and all that?
But maybe it also doesn't, because, for example, and full disclosure here actually, both Albanese and Peter Dutton are coming into Mamamia this week, and they're sitting down with Kate Langbrook for No Filter, and those interviews will be great, no question, right? The people who are voting, rightly or wrongly, they want to know about the people they're voting for. We're going to hear a lot about policy when this election is actually announced, because although it feels like we're living in an election campaign, it hasn't actually been announced yet. If politicians only stand there and talk to you about policy and about what people generally think of as boring facts, and this is what I'm going to do for you, and they get accused of being impersonal robots, right? If they go too far the other way, remember Scott Morrison and the ukulele around the barbecue table on 60 Minutes? That really didn't go well for him, because people were like, I'm not sure if we can't trust him with the melody of April Sun in Cuba, if we can trust him with the economy. I think that what's interesting, particularly about these two, is that revealing a bit about their personal lives makes them more relatable and interesting in a genuine way, because actually they've both got in the terms of political history of Australia, quite interesting personal lives, backstory-wise. Albo is only our third unmarried Prime Minister ever, after, I think, McEwen in the 60s, and he was a widower, and, of course, Julia Gillard, right? So the fact that Albo was not married when he was first campaigning was seen as a bit like, because traditionally we like our politicians to be in steady, traditional relationships. It makes me think he's a steady, traditional guy. The fact that he's got engaged while he's in office, kind of interesting, like Jacinda Ardern, when she had a baby in office, it's kind of interesting. Now people are like, okay, so if Albo wins again and he and Jodie are getting married, I want to know more about her, more about this. And I actually think that's kind of valid. And Dutton has been married before. He's got a child from a previous relationship. So again, his story isn't that linear and straightforward. And I actually think that's interesting, gives some depth, and people can go, oh, I can kind of relate to that because my relationship isn't that straightforward. I'm divorced or I'm building a step family or whatever. So I think it's interesting. I agree with you that it's fluffy and inauthentic. That's also a trap, though, right? Because remember, if we look over to America, how Kamala Harris, who had to establish who she was, in inverted commas, in this short period of time, people just kept saying over and over again, I don't know who she is. I don't know who she is. And they want to be able to scratch the surface. And how do you do that in an authentic way?
I also think there's a way in which the olden days, when we refused to look at politicians' private lives, encouraged this kind of default nuclear heterosexual family feedback loop, because we sort of knew that all these male politicians had wives and children, and therefore, because they all had the same story, essentially, we didn't need to hear it. But now that we accept that politicians are real people who hopefully come from diverse backgrounds and have done all sorts of things before coming to politics, we accept that they might have a more complicated story, and we naturally want to hear about it.
But isn't this how we get to a point where, for example, I remember when there was a big discussion about sexism in politics, Scott Morrison stands there and says, I have daughters. I think that we can go too far into I'm going to almost sell or use my family.
And if you don't have daughters, for instance, to bring back Kamala Harris, she doesn't have children. And that was also some on the right said, well, how can she really care about the future of this country if she doesn't have children?
And I think that's an important point because it gets used differently against women.
Yeah.
So while we're in the precipice of an election campaign where, as you say, two men have had maybe not the most traditional trajectories in terms of marriage and children, I don't think we would be nearly as forgiving if either of them were women.
Well, no. And on that point, and we've got Amelia here, so I'm exploiting that fact. Riddle me this, Amelia, if we look over to America in this regard, right? Broadly speaking, the right, the MAGA right, well, not necessarily the MAGA right, but the traditional Republican right, very big on family values, right? Very big on it. They think that one of the things that's really gone wrong is we're way too accepting of different kinds of families and these pesky single women without children, the cat ladies and all this stuff.
Oh, that's what's gone wrong. I was wondering.
Yeah, that's what they're saying has gone wrong. And yet, some of their most prominent poster boys, including Elon Musk, who appears to be running things with his chainsaw, have when I just said before, that Dutton and Albo have slightly different stories about their family dynamics. This week, he's embroiled in some kind of paternity situation with a woman who claims that she's the mother of his 13th child to 4 different women. Now, no judgment about that, but it's clear that he is not involved in a lot of these children's lives except for the one that he likes to roll out.
Yeah, can we judge him a little bit? I think that's okay.
Yes. Yeah. Except for the one he likes to roll out as a prop. And then we know famously he has a daughter he doesn't speak to because she is trans. And she said this week, I keep finding out I've got new siblings on the internet. There's been 6 now, 6 different siblings that she's found out about on the internet. Riddle me this then. So how the conservative right family values people, now they're all this is very chaotic.
It's such a good question, Holly. And I was musing on it as you were speaking, and it's almost as though the left and the right have changed sides. Because you think back to the 90s and Bill Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky, and it was the right, it was the Republicans who said this betrays a lack of family values. We can't trust him in the White House when he's doing this in his private life. And it was the left who said, oh, forget about it. It was consensual. There's nothing to see here. Move along. wrong. Now, what's interesting is that the American left has now revised that opinion on the Lewinsky situation. They point to the power imbalance between the president and an intern as saying that it could never be a fully consensual dynamic between the two of them. And it's the right now who have decided that everyone's private lives don't matter in politics. And I was trying to think, why did that happen? And when did it happen? And I think you can trace it to the election of America's first black president. And that was when the right really lost their minds and decided that in order to gain back power, they had to prioritize political power above everything else in a way they never had before. George W. Bush, lots of criticisms of him, lots of unnecessary wars, but largely played within the rules and the norms that had been set through many decades of American political life. But come Obama, that's when the Republicans decided they weren't going to play by the rules anymore. They weren't going to play by the rules in politics, and they were going to discard the moralistic rules that they had in private. You just have to look at the fact that the Christian right in the US has thrown their lot behind Donald Trump, a man who, as we've talked about many times, is not exactly a poster boy for family values, because all they want is a nationwide abortion ban. And they've decided that it doesn't matter who gets them there or what they do in their private life. The goal is the important thing, the end point.
So I wonder if we've overemphasized, if there's a bit of a myth about how much people actually care about who you are and what your story is. For Albo and Dutton, I do think that there are features of their story that deeply matter. I think that Albanese, when he talks about his narrative and growing up in council housing, that is part of who he is and how he projects his values. For Peter Dutton, I think being a police officer for a decade, that matters and it's relevant. But do I need to know that Albanese likes to watch Netflix with Jodie?
How can you really say that it doesn't matter how you don't care at all how anyone lives their life, what they like, what they watch, what they don't watch, who they live with, who their friends are, what they like to eat for dinner? It doesn't matter at all.
Think
about when you're creating a character and all the little things that you pull in to tell the story about that person. This is what they're doing, is they're telling you a story about them. And some of it's authentic, like the fact that he is the uncoolest DJ you've ever seen. I don't think he'd make that shit up, right? And the thing about Dutton is his job is different. He has to convince people, because there is a narrative out there about him that he is some kind of robot. He has to convince people that he is a human being, whereas the Albo's maybe a little bit too much of one.
I just care insofar as it's going to dictate how they run a country I'm a citizen of.
But we're also going to know all that, right? Like the policy is out there, but people glaze over when you talk about policy. You want to find it, go to that. They will be talking about that endlessly. They also have to colour in some of the gaps.
I worry that this is like the celebrification of politics, and I think it's a trap.
Forever. Like, I think that every Australian Prime Minister has been in the Weekly if they were invited with their wife, with their kids. And personally, I find it more refreshing that now instead of on the stage, it's just cookie cutter, like, you know, this is my wife. We've been married since we were 20. Here are my beautiful children. Now we're seeing some different versions of that.
And it is a trap, Jessie. I agree that way. But there's a trap the other way. You see what's happening in the US now, where you do have one side that has decided it doesn't matter what politicians are like as people. And just to bring up one example, Pete Hegseth, who was in charge of the Department of Defense, he had his confirmation hearings recently. His own mother sent him an email that leaked saying that he was an abuser of women. He has acknowledged a drinking problem and has been seen in Washington, D.C. drinking 3 gin and tonics for breakfast, which is 2 more than I'd have at breakfast time. And he has what some have called a white supremacist tattoo. But apparently
feels relevant.
This is all about character, right?